My wife trusted me, and that was her first mistake, mostly because she didn't realize what kind of man she married. Not the dangerous kind, not the scary kind, just the kind who thinks confidence is a substitute for skill. She asked me to handle something simple while she ran out for groceries, and I said yes immediately, because saying no would have required admitting I might fail. Saying yes is how I always start trouble. I don't even know why confidence comes so naturally, but it does, and it's always the first step on the scenic route to disaster. Started off thinking, okay, I've got this. How hard can it be? Which is what I say before every mess I ever make. The thing about trust is it's invisible. You can't see it. You don't know it's gone until it's too late. Assumed because she asked me, it meant she believed in me. That belief is heavy. It's like carrying a backpack full of bricks while trying to walk through a minefield. The bricks are invisible until you step wrong. So I begin my task, and I immediately realize there are options. Options are my enemy. If there's more than one way to do something, that's where I start inventing rules that make no sense. I rationalize every choice like I'm preparing to defend it in court later. Every small decision feels important, which it is, but not in the way I think. I'm building a structure in my mind where there shouldn't even be a structure. Complexity is my comfort zone, and she's about to find out why that's a problem. Halfway through, I start noticing subtle cues. Things are not going the way she would have done them, but in my head, everything is fine. Confidence has blinded me to reality. Imagine her coming home, seeing the brilliance of my method and saying, "Wow, you're amazing." I laugh at the idea, even as I realize I may have already crossed a line, but it's too late to stop now. Once you're this far, backing up is not an option. I've committed to the chaos. When she walks in, I can tell immediately that something is wrong. Not because she's yelling, not because she's angry, but because she's quiet. Quiet is the worst. Quiet means calculation. Means she's evaluating every action I took and preparing to adjust the world accordingly. I try to explain, but any explanation I give sounds like justification. Justification is useless when trust has been stretched to its limit. She doesn't need my reasoning. She needs me to admit that maybe, just maybe, I'm not as skilled as I pretend to be. That's when I realized the full weight of the situation. Her trust was not a compliment. It was a challenge, an invisible gauntlet thrown across the living room, daring me to trip. And I've not just tripped. I've rolled into the chandelier while waving proudly at the mess I created. I stand there, holding the results of my overconfidence, trying to convince myself that the journey is as important as the outcome, knowing full well that she sees the outcome, and that's all that matters. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think, maybe I can fix this. But fixing implies that what I did was wrong. Admitting that means I have to confront the fact that trust is fragile enough that my good intentions might not survive contact with reality. I try to step in. Every step I take is met with a glance that says, "You've already done enough." And I understand that this is the final act of my performance. A man who believes he's helping, slowly realizing he's now the problem, and still standing there, hoping that confidence alone might be enough to survive the evening. The moment my wife trusted me, I felt a strange kind of pride, the kind that usually precedes disaster. I said yes immediately, without hesitation, because hesitation feels like weakness. Weakness is not part of my toolkit. Confidence, on the other hand, is automatic. It's the first thing that kicks in The thing I rely on before I even know what I'm doing. Saying yes felt like a victory, like I had already succeeded, even though the task hadn't even begun. That's always how it starts. The illusion of competence, a prelude to chaos. Imagined her leaving the house, completely at ease, thinking she had delegated responsibility to someone reliable. For a moment, I let myself believe that too. That belief was comfortable, the kind you hold onto even as subtle alarms begin to ring in the background. Confidence is such a dangerous friend because it masks doubt so efficiently. It tells you everything is fine, even when you're standing in the middle of a slow motion train wreck that hasn't started moving yet. I didn't ask any questions. That's step one in every disaster I've ever caused. Questions imply uncertainty. I like to appear certain. I nodded, smiled, and accepted the assignment as though it were trivial, all the while knowing deep down that trivial is relative and I don't naturally operate in relativity. Trivial to me is often complicated. Complicated to anyone else is catastrophic. Ignored the details because my brain has this automatic defense mechanism. If I don't see a problem immediately, it doesn't exist. Then I started overthinking, but in a very controlled, confident way. Imagined all the possible outcomes that might make her unhappy and prepared mental justifications for each one. This is my default mode. I create invisible scaffolding to support my mistakes before they even happen. It's a strange kind of optimism built on the belief that if I prepare enough reasons for my actions, somehow retroactively become correct. In my head, that's what professionalism looks like. In reality, it's the first sign of a spiral. As I stepped into the task, I realized there were choices to make. Choices are where the fun begins, or the trouble, depending on who you ask. Each option seemed viable, but each option had consequences I wasn't entirely ready to anticipate. Yet I proceeded with the same unwavering confidence I had at the start, narrating my own decisions internally like I was telling a story for later review. My confidence doubled as I told myself, this is how a responsible adult handles it, even as I had no actual proof of adult competence. By the time she was out the door, I felt both empowered and prepared, which is a dangerous combination. Empowered because I was in control, prepared because I had already invented multiple explanations for potential failures. Both of these feelings were false security, the kind that lulls you into a state where mistakes are inevitable, but still surprising when they happen. I looked around to start fully unaware that trusting me had set the stage for the first act of a very long comedy, where I would gradually learn that confidence without clarity is the most expensive tool in the house. The real challenge started the moment I realized what trusted actually meant. Trust sounds simple, but it's heavy. It's invisible, weightless, and yet somehow capable of breaking you if handled incorrectly. When my wife trusted me, she didn't just hand over a task, she handed over responsibility, expectation, and a silent pressure that I wasn't equipped to measure. I didn't feel that pressure at first. I just saw an opportunity to prove that I was competent, capable, and most importantly, confident. Trust, in my head, was a compliment. In reality, it was a ticking time bomb disguised as a nod of approval. Approach the task with an inflated sense of optimism. Trust made me feel like a hero in the making. Imagine the moment she'd return and see how perfectly I handled everything. I would get that subtle smile, that look that says, I knew you could do it. That anticipation was intoxicating, which is dangerous because anticipation makes you bold. Boldness is the first ingredient in a slow motion disaster. I was moving forward with the confidence of a man, who has no idea the minefield beneath his feet. As I started, the trust she gave me felt like it, rules I couldn't read. I knew I was supposed to respect it, but respecting it implied knowing the boundaries, and boundaries were invisible. I tried to fill the gaps with my own assumptions. Assumptions are funny that way. They feel safe, but they're almost always wrong. I rationalized every choice I made as an enhancement, a way to honor the trust rather than betray it. That's the trap. When you overthink how to honor trust, you create more opportunities to fail than if you had just done the obvious thing. Kept telling myself that her trust was proof she believed in my abilities, which made me double down. If trust means confidence in someone's judgment, then I assumed my judgment was flawless. I treated her faith like a shield, would protect me from mistakes. The reality is, trust doesn't protect you. It exposes you. Every small error becomes amplified because it's not just a mistake anymore. It's a crack in someone's belief in you. I was blind to that, and blind people are notoriously good at making things worse without realizing it. As I moved along, created a mental map of how I thought she expected things to be done. Ignored what she actually wanted because I assumed my map was correct. My internal logic was airtight, but the map was completely imaginary. That's the essence of comedy, in this scenario, confidence colliding with invisible rules. The more trust you're given, the higher the stakes, and the higher the stakes, the funnier the eventual crash. Every decision I made felt responsible in my head. Each step was rational, careful, and deliberate. But trust doesn't translate through mental reasoning. It doesn't care about internal logic. It reacts only to outcomes, and outcomes are influenced by tiny details that only the person giving trust fully understands. That's when I started realizing that trusting me was not an invitation to creativity, was a quiet test of whether I could navigate something simple without complicating it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could sense that the test had already begun, that the trust she gave me was not a compliment, it was a dare, and I had just accepted it. Every choice I made felt completely logical, at least in my head. I had reasons for everything. The confidence I carried convinced me that those reasons were not just good, they were indisputable. I wasn't guessing. I was deciding there's a difference, and in my mind, that difference is what separates a responsible adult from a reckless one. I moved step by step, narrating the process to myself, giving each action a purpose and every error a justification that only I could understand. That's where the humor starts. Everything seems reasonable to me, but to anyone else, it looks like chaos disguised as strategy. Started linking one decision to the next, creating a chain of logic so tight it felt unbreakable. If A seemed right, B naturally followed, and C became inevitable. Every choice built on the previous one, like blocks stacked carefully in my imagination. The thing is, this chain existed only in my head. The moment someone else looked at it, it didn't resemble anything I thought it did. That's the comedy. Being utterly convinced you're right while evidence piles up that you're very, very wrong. Smart. I explained my actions internally like I was narrating a documentary about someone who almost had it together. I did this for a reason. I'd say, rehearsing the moment I would justify every step. I believed that reasoning could somehow retroactively validate the outcome. Had not yet considered that internal logic doesn't travel well. People outside my brain don't care about the cleverness of the reasoning, they care about the results. And results, as it turns out, don't care about good intentions either. As I moved forward, my logic became more elaborate. I added layers to the process, not because they were necessary, but because they seemed responsible. Efficiency and thoroughness became my guiding principles, though ironically, neither had much to do with what was actually required. Each added layer gave me the illusion of control while subtly steering me further away from the original task. Illusion is intoxicating. It makes you feel like an expert, even as the project spirals out of your hands. Even started anticipating potential criticisms before they happen. I had responses ready for questions that weren't asked yet, defending decisions that hadn't been questioned. That's a type of confidence only someone completely detached from reality could sustain. It's proactive, it's strategic, it's completely unnecessary. Yet it made me feel like I was prepared for anything. What I wasn't prepared for was the silent judgment that awaited me. I was so invested in defending my choices internally that I didn't notice the gap widening between what I thought I was doing and what she actually wanted. I was on a mental autopilot where every decision confirmed the previous one. Backtracking wasn't an option because admitting error would require dismantling the entire chain of logic. I kept going, fully confident that this path was correct, unaware that each carefully reasoned step was bringing me closer to a comedic disaster that only a wife's observation could reveal. As soon as I realized there might be a tiny problem, though not yet visible to anyone else, I did what I always do, tried to fix it. That's my instinct. I don't pause, I don't stop, I escalate. Fixing in my world means adding layers, making adjustments, and imagining improvements that weren't requested but feel necessary. I tell myself I'm being proactive, but what I'm really doing is building a tower of complications on a foundation that was already wobbly. Every adjustment is a commitment, and once committed, you can't step back without admitting you were wrong from the start. The first fixes are subtle, small, careful, seemingly harmless changes that make me feel responsible and capable. But each fix introduces another variable, another choice, another decision that must be justified in my head. I convince myself I'm protecting the task, but in reality, I'm creating more potential for disaster. It's funny, in a slow, inevitable way, I tell myself, this will all make sense in the end. That phrase is always a trap. It's optimism disguised as planning, and optimism is rarely enough. What really gets me is the internal pressure. I've invested effort, mental energy, and pride into what I'm doing. That makes stepping back almost impossible. Stopping would be an admission that I overreached, and I cannot face that possibility, not yet. So I double down. I tell myself that the more effort I put in, the better the outcome will be, and effort always looks impressive. That's the lie I live by. Effort can cover a lot of mistakes, except when it can't, and usually, moment comes with dramatic timing. As I move through these enhancements, I start to admire my own cleverness. Think about how resourceful I'm being, the way I've anticipated potential pitfalls, the layers of strategy I've added. My mind, I'm creating a masterpiece. In reality, I've complicated a simple request into a multi-step, barely recognizable project that would confuse anyone who looked at it, including me, if I weren't narrating it internally. That's the essence of comedy. You believe you're solving a problem while simultaneously creating a new one that's bigger, louder, and more ridiculous. The more I add, the more confident I feel. Confidence has nothing to do with reality at this point. It's entirely a mental construct that allows me to keep going. I imagine the moment she returns, sees the care I've taken, is impressed by my thoroughness. That's my justification for continuing. I don't see that she's not impressed. Each added layer has transformed a simple task into something chaotic and fragile. My internal narrative is a shield, keeping me focused on the illusion of progress while ignoring the actual outcome. By the time I'm halfway through, I'm exhausted, not physically, but mentally. I've created a task that requires explanation, supervision, and patience, and I'm still standing there thinking, this is fine. That's the hallmark of escalation. The belief that additional effort will correct the mistakes made by effort in the first place. I've crossed the point of no return. So much complexity that undoing any part of it would be more difficult than just continuing. Continuing is exactly what I do, fully convinced that my enhancements are improving things, while in reality, they're building a comedy of errors that is about to make its grand entrance when she walks back in. The moment she walked back into the house, the atmosphere shifted immediately, though nothing had happened yet. She didn't yell. She didn't sigh dramatically. She just paused, and that pause carried more weight than a full-blown argument ever could. Silence has a way of cutting deeper than words. It forces you to notice every little detail, every imperfection, every small misstep you made along the way. I stood there, holding the results of my effort, watching her evaluate everything in the quietest way possible, and that quiet alone was terrifying. I tried to read her face to find some hint of forgiveness, but there wasn't one. Not yet. There was only observation, the kind that weighs your decisions and quietly notes the failures without commentary. That's worse than yelling, because yelling gives you a chance to defend yourself. Silence doesn't allow for defense. It only allows for self-reflection. And at that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted that much reflection. Every small movement I made seemed like it might trigger a reaction I couldn't predict. So I froze, holding my hands as if stillness could somehow correct the mistakes I had already made. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning what I had done, and I could feel the judgment stacking up with every second. Not judgment in anger, they're smart, but judgment in disbelief, the kind that silently catalogs every error and files it for later reference. I started to internally narrate everything I had done, preparing explanations that I assumed she would never ask for, but that I might need in case questions came. That's the danger of silent evaluation. It forces you to confront your own reasoning in a way that no spoken critique ever could. Her quiet stare made me realize that I was no longer helping, I was in the way. Everything I thought was a solution now looked like evidence of overcomplication. Every added step, every enhancement I had proudly implemented in my mind was now a monument to my overconfidence. Escalated a simple task into something so layered and complex that it required supervision, patience, a level of understanding that only the person who asked could provide. And she didn't need my understanding. She needed results. I tried to say something, to bridge the silence with words that might explain my logic, but opening my mouth felt dangerous. Any attempt to explain would sound defensive, and defensiveness only confirms the problem. So I stayed quiet, hoping my presence alone wouldn't worsen the situation. Every second of silence stretched, each one heavier than the last, until I realized that she didn't need me to speak. She needed me to be still, to acknowledge that my good intentions had not been enough. In that moment, I fully understood that trust had a price. Her trust had allowed me the freedom to act, but it had also made my mistakes more visible, more consequential. I was standing at the intersection of effort and chaos, recognizing that confidence and initiative are double-edged swords when the person who set the expectations is watching. The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, a prelude to the eventual reckoning. And I could feel it, every subtle glance and every second stretching out, that my overconfidence had turned me from problem solver into problem itself, leaving me awkwardly positioned in the center of a quiet, judgmental audience that didn't even need to speak to make its point. By the time I realized the full scope of the situation, I wasn't just standing in the middle of a task gone wrong. I had become part of the problem itself. The trust she had given me had shifted from a compliment to a challenge, and I was failing spectacularly. Every movement I made, every decision I attempted felt like it carried the weight of both my own pride and the expectations she had silently placed on me. I was hyper-aware, not of the task, but of the fact that I had overstepped invisible boundaries, and that awareness was exhausting. I tried to be helpful, cautiously stepping in where I thought I could fix something, but each attempt seemed to create more problems than it solved. The very actions I believed were responsible and deliberate now looked like interference. I had crossed a threshold where effort no longer equaled progress. It's funny in retrospect because at the start, confidence felt like an asset. By this point, confidence was a liability, making every move I made look louder, more dramatic, more obviously unnecessary. I wasn't just wrong, I was conspicuously, embarrassingly wrong. I found myself shrinking into the background, trying to make myself smaller in the room, hoping my presence wouldn't exacerbate the chaos I had already created. I realized that sometimes the best contribution is no contribution at all, but that lesson comes late, usually after the comedy of errors has played out. I was standing there, fully capable of action, but action was no longer safe. Every instinct I had to help was now a potential catastrophe. At the same time, my mind was still narrating the situation. I was reviewing every step, mentally replaying decisions, justifications, and enhancements I had made, realizing that each one had contributed to the very problem I now couldn't fix. Internal logic had guided me confidently for so long was useless in the face of reality. Trust doesn't respond to reasoning, responds to outcomes, and the outcomes were stacked against me. My good intentions were irrelevant. That's a uniquely uncomfortable position to occupy. I wanted to apologize, but even apologies felt risky. Apologizing could reopen the discussion, draw attention back to my mistakes, or worse, suggest that I hadn't fully grasped the situation. Yet staying silent wasn't an option either, because doing nothing in the presence of failure is an admission of culpability. I was trapped in a delicate balance where every potential action carried its own risk. The safest choice was to stand still and hope that my presence wouldn't worsen the situation. By now, I could feel the weight of the trust she had placed in me. It wasn't just a task, it was a mirror reflecting my overconfidence. My assumptions and my inability to simplify. Trust had exposed every flaw in my thinking, every step where confidence outweighed competence, and every point where my helpful intentions had escalated the chaos. I was still present, still capable, but completely aware that my presence alone could influence the outcome negatively. I had become the variable that couldn't be controlled, the human complication layered on top of my original mistakes, standing awkwardly in the center of a situation that had once been simple, now unrecognizable, entirely my own doing. So here's the thing, when your wife trusts you, it's not just a compliment, it's a setup. It's like being handed the keys to a car that's already teetering on the edge of a cliff, and somehow you're expected to drive it perfectly while blindfolded. I thought I could handle it. I thought confidence was enough. And as usual, it wasn't. What I learned very slowly and painfully is that trust in marriage is a delicate thing. One wrong move, one overconfident step, and suddenly your good intentions aren't impressive. They're hilarious in the worst possible way. That's the beauty of it. Even when you mess up spectacularly, everyone can laugh at it later, except in the moment. When you're standing there, realizing that trust isn't just given, it's tested, and you just failed the test spectacularly.